Hey, Alec Miller here, founder of Rose and Rogues, and today we're talking all things Liquigen through C4D. And that's going to be whitewater particle simulations for not just the spray and the foam and the bubbles, but also for the entire liquid. And why you want to do it that way, why that might be a superior way as to exporting a whole giant mesh that then you have to work with. Liquigen is still an alpha, but in my book, it's already a heavyweight for just how quickly I can get amazing sims out. There's also going to be a few tips and tricks in here, so you might not want to skip around as much as you normally do. So I'll stop yapping and let's jump into the tutorial. If you have been following along, you can use my quick start guide to get you quickly started. So this already has everything set up and explained in a pretty intuitive way, I think, for you. One of the things that they've added, though, that I'm going to change right away, is our ground. So instead of checkerboard, we now have units. And I just think it looks nicer, and it's easier to tell how big your sim is, and it's just a nice quality of life improvement. The other thing is, I don't know why, but this import's pretty dark, so we're going to brighten it up. And then I'm going to move our camera here in place. All right. So there's a few things I want to change. First off, I don't really want those colliders. These guys are play objects, and we're just going to turn all those off. Okay. And then we're going to kind of reset our sim here. So we're going to set the height, just hit reset on both of these. And then as far as the collider and emitter, I want these both to be a box, and I want them to be the same size more or less. So we're just going to choose one of these, and then what we're going to do is just make this like, maybe like 20 by 20 by 5. But we don't want our emitter to be that tall. So we're gonna drop our emitter down to 1, and then I'm gonna hit restart. And now we have this square here. We have turbulence kind of sending this stuff all over the place. I don't really want that. I want just like a nice wave. And so what instead we're gonna do is come up to our waves. We're gonna drop that way down, amplitude way down to 0.5, and the animation speed down to 0.5, and our scale down a bit. Let's go a little bit farther. Okay, it's still pretty wavy, so let's drop this down to 0.2. There we go. Okay, so that's decent, but it's kind of making waves everywhere, and what I want it to do is just make one big wave that we can kind of follow. So in order to do that, all we're going to do is go to our bias, and we're going to add some keyframes. So we're going to bias it Y positive, let's say 2. Alrighty. And there we go. Now we got our keyframes down here. So now it's going to shoot it that way. And I'm just going to drop that down to 0 after a few frames. And so now we get this nice curling wave. And that's sort of the fastest way to do it without needing to add in a ton of shapes. I'm going to give you a quick pro tip. And that is, if you don't want something crashing up against the side here, you can do something kind of fun, which is you can grab a force, and you can do a drag, and then you mask it with a shape. And I'm gonna hit show shape on that force drag. This is a little bigger so you guys can kind of see, zoom in. And we're gonna turn up the strength. So I'm just gonna make it 10 so you can see it real clear. And we're gonna make our shape over here, make it a box, and make it way bigger. Like I said, it's 20 by like 4 by 5. Go. So now we have this sort of shape at the very edge of our simulation. Oops. And maybe make it a little bigger. We're gonna make it 24 just so it overshoots it. And what this is gonna do, if I turn off the visibility on it, is really kill anything on this side. And so now as this comes and crashes in, it's going to hit our box and stop. But the problem with that is it stops real suddenly, and that's no good. So what we need to do is turn up the fall off. And we can make that distance like, let's do 4. All right. And then you can do 100% essentially here on the mask fall off. And so what that's going to do, as you can see, is now it's slowing down as it gets to this edge. and that's too much because I have it at 10. But if I drop this down to like 5, let's say, and now it won't have that huge crash as it hits. So that's just a pro tip. And the other thing you can do this is if it's still raising and moving a lot, you can grab in a force and add a second gravity essentially, which is a constant. So we have another constant. We're going to link that to the same primitive, and this is going to pull it down, right? And so you can kind of flatten it out. And the reason to do this is it makes it easier to blend your sim with something else if you know you kind of have this hard edge that it's not going to rise above. So you can see that that edge is lower than everything else. And what you could do is you could kind of copy the shape a whole bunch and put it all around, or make a custom shape that's just like a little square, right? And you could put this on all the sides that you need flat. And when you do that, it means that this sim now, I could extend it way easier, right? Does that make sense? So this is gonna be a lot easier to extend using like a plane, and I make a giant plane. So that way I'm only really simming this one spot, but then I can have a plane running away from it into infinity that's just like a displacement map. And so that way you're not having to sim a giant ocean if, let's say, you want it to like jump out of the water here or land into the water here. And then you're just simming this one spot. So that's just a pro tip. I've used that a number of times on various projects just to force something, you know, to kind of be the way I need it to be. And you can also use this, you know, like this to make waves. It's just an interesting, more subtle way than using a collider or a collision object to try to force your water to move and do what you need it to do. So now that we have all that there, we kind of have our water not crashing up against the edge. Let's take a look at our whitewater. So I already have the foam and spray set up by default, but if you don't, it's pretty easy to create it. So all you have to do is come over to your whitewater, drag it out, choose whitewater, and then choose sources. Now, originally, in order to get this to show up, you'd have to plug it into a shape. And then what that would do is create, and we can still do that. Here, we'll do a circle here and make it nice and big so it's easy to see. And what that does is it creates particles, it creates whitewater only where your shape is. Just make that a little bigger, and we'll go down top or down so you can kind of see that better. And let's turn up this real quick just so we can see this really clear. There we go. All right, so now it's only spawning whitewater particles where our shape is. And if we want to invert it, we can, and that will do everywhere except for right there. So it's a nice way to isolate stuff or remove a spot if you want from, you know, if you have a ship and you only want the ship creating whitewater, right? You don't want this crazy whitewater everywhere, just on the ship. You could import your ship shape here, and it will only create it within that domain. So that's a really nice feature to have. Once they're created, they can go anywhere, but this is just where they spawn from. But if you turn it off, now in the latest version of Liquigen, it by default creates them everywhere. So that's nice because you don't have to worry about adding that in. All right, let's reset our settings here and go over them real quick. So let's just go through the node really quick, and then I'll explain how it all works. So activity is pretty obvious, just is it there or not? So it's just on or off essentially. Show, also same thing, just it's on here, but here it just turns it off so you don't see it. This is a good idea. The activity is good if you don't want it starting until a certain point, you know, and then you have it starting. So here you can see we don't have a ton, versus show, it's simulating it, but it's just not showing it. So that's really the only difference between those two. Resources is just how many particles, you know, you're going to allow it to make. Depending on how beefy your graphics card is, will determine how much you can change that. If you come up to view and you hit stats, you can see how much of your VRAM you're using up. And as I increase that, you're going to see we're using more and more. Let's hit apply. There we go. More and more of our VRAM. So if you have a big card, you can turn it up. If you have a small card, you can keep it low. Simulation. So this just controls which one of these you're simulating, or all of them. So it's spray, foam, and bubbles. And we're going to go through those each in just a second as soon as I go over this next section. This next section is source, which we currently have here. This is great if you're going to be using a shape you can control it this way. If you're not going to use a shape though, what you can simply do is turn that off, and then it becomes its own source. And so if I turn these on, you can see it's still simulating even though we don't have a source, because it just assumes that you just want to use this one node. So it lets you be a little bit cleaner if you don't really want to have that go back and forth between that second node. But you need that second node if you're going to be masking it off. So, you know, you have multiple sources with multiple masks, and that kind of really helps for that. But for here, we're just going to have one source, and it's going to be itself. And this keeps everything in one spot. So all of these source settings affect all of these simulation settings. So just know that, like, if you change one, it's going to affect each of these. But that's to help it all be accurate, because you know, bubbles should create foam, trapped air should create bubbles, and so on and so forth. So let me quickly turn off our liquid mesh. Hopefully we can still see this pretty good. And then let's take a look at all the different things we're simulating. Range is going to be how you control how much is spawned based off of a setting. So like trapped air, I'm saying if there's hardly any trapped air at all, go ahead, spawn a bunch of particles. And here I'm turning it up, you can see, and there has to be a ton of trapped air for there to be any particles. Air gets trapped when, you know, there's a gap in the water and then that gap gets covered. So here I'm not really getting anything because there's not a lot of trapped air, but the farther down I go, the more this is going to create bubbles all the time. So I can just create a constant stream of bubbles if I want. And that's good if you're doing like a bubble bath or something that needs bubbles all the time. But for us, we don't really need that many. We don't want that much. Just keep it kind of low. Max depth is pretty clear here. If I go back down, so it's going all the time. So now we're get constant bubbles. I'm saying it can only go down so far, right? So here you can see we're just getting bubbles on more or less the higher parts, and the more farther down I go, the deeper the bubbles are spawned. So again, as always, you can go beyond your limits here by just putting it in. So if you run up against a wall, just increase that number manually. And you can see now it's extended. All right, so next is our crest. And so to see this, what I'm going to do is get rid of our trapped air for a little bit. And I've turned off our bubbles so they won't be distracting. And now what we can do is turn up our wave crest emission rate. And hopefully this will make this more obvious. Okay, there we go. All right, so you can see it's not spawning any foam until the waves crash. And I can turn that up really high. And now they really have to be going for it to make any foam. And if I turn that down low, pretty much anywhere is going to spawn some foam. And if I make the whole range, it's going to be just constant, no matter where the water is. If it's moving, if it's, you know, has some displacement, it's going to be spawning. And so what this does is, like, if you want a really like classical wave, right, where only the edge is all foam and the rest of it doesn't have too much foam, that's how you're going to control that. Let's reset these to default. Initial lifetime is pretty obvious. It's just how long they last, you know. And then you have your spread and for both of these, and that's how far away they're going to move after spawning. So if I turn these down, you'll notice they stick pretty much right to, let me turn on our liquid mesh again. It's sticking right in those like crevices. It ain't going nowhere. It's staying where it needs to stay. Let's also turn up the emission rate. There we go. Versus if I make the spread super high here, you're gonna see it's gonna start going a little bit everywhere. Thing we didn't really look at too much is spray. That's because it's sort of hard to see here. If I turn my particles way up, let's see, and I turn the amount of particles here allowed up, maybe, and I make the range really high, maybe you'll be able to see some spray. There we go. We're getting a little bit of spray there when I turn my settings real crazy. But spray is going to be a lot farther away from the source than the other ones. They're going to be a lot more chaotic and go everywhere. It's nice to have just like a little extra that you can kind of really see it there. That's probably the best place to see it here. I'll pause it. There we go. So that's the spray. You can see it's really fine particles that are spraying up. They die quick. and it just adds a little extra level of detail. So spray is great if you really want to sell that this stuff is like moving quick, but it's sort of hard to see and sort of hard to create regularly, and that's because you really don't want to overdo it with the spray. The foam is going to do plenty, and this is just adding a few extra particles shooting off randomly here and there like they would in real water. But really the foam is going to be for your cresting, and that kind of nice white edge, and then your bubbles are going to be for the underneath and floating around. So there you have it. That's essentially all the whitewater. So finally, let's take a look at dynamics for our whitewater. So you're going to want to leave most of these at default, but if you really need to change them for specific reasons, you can. This makes the foam stay on the surface. So I turn that off. You can see I've dropped it down to negative, and now it's spawning the foam within instead of on top of the simulation. So that's a very particular need you might have. If you want to do something very specific, maybe if you're making like bioluminescent, algae that goes off when something under the water is hitting it, that would be what you'd want to use this for. Main liquids drains is pretty obvious. It means that if this is draining something, if I have draining the water out of the center, then it's also going to drain the foam. So if I turn that off, now the foam stays, but the water drains. I don't know why you would need that, but I'm sure there's somebody who could find a reason. Next is spray, apply main liquids force, exactly what it sounds like. If you turn that off, there's various forces we have up here, right? And you can see that now all those wonderful forces that would normally be stopping everything from hitting the edge aren't applying anymore, and it's just flying off and splattering against that wall. So again, I'd keep that on. Gravity is a force. All these are forces. You generally want it all affecting the same things. But again, maybe you have a specific reason. Buoyancy's kind of cool. If I turn off my non-spray here and I hit play, you can see we're getting a little bit of spray. And if I turn up the buoyancy a lot, what will happen is it will go flying everywhere. So now we can kind of see it here. So as it crests now, it's going to be sending it way higher. So it makes it a lot more chaotic and sends it flying. Let's see, that's a good angle to see that. So I turn it up. There it is. It's just shooting up into the sky. So, it's good if you want to add some chaos or directionality to your spray. And if you had it go in a special direction, right? Let's say negative Y for us, so it goes that way. So now it's going to go shooting off in that direction as it spawns. If I turn that way up, you'll see it flying that way. So that might be good if you have like a waterfall or something, right? And you want to make it clear that the spray is all going in one direction. Alrighty. So let me cover all the decays at once. Decay is pretty simple. It's the rate at which it dies. So right now I have it at 100, so it's dying super fast, and I have it on the foam. But if I drop this down, eventually you're going to see that the foam comes on and then dies kind of quick. Versus if I lower this, now it's staying around a little longer before it disappears. And if I drop it way, way, way down, it's going to last for pretty much ever. You, again, just tweak this as you need it, but the defaults are pretty good. By one just means it's just going to slowly go away 1 unit at a time. And then drag. So here you go. That's a good example. You can see that as we create the foam, does it move or does it just stay in spot? So I have it at 0, which is the default. It moves with the mesh completely. And if I crank this way up, you'll see it's going to start to get left behind, and then eventually it will just freeze in place. Bubble buoyancy is the same thing as our spray buoyancy. It's just how fast and how high it's moving. By default, this is gravity. This is the inverse of gravity here, but you can turn that down and then have your bubbles fall to the bottom of the ocean. This could be useful, again, if you need something to sink as it goes. But generally bubbles rise. But you can think of creative solutions for this, right? Bubbles don't have to be bubbles. They're just particles. All these are going to be spawned as particles, and then you can put whatever you want on them. So keep that in mind. Bubble drag, we already covered drag. And then foam rate is how much foam is created by the bubbles themselves. Okay, so you can kind of see here that our bubbles, as they get created, create foam on top. And this is the rate they do that. So if I turn this way up, you'll see where our bubbles are, way more foam is created. So here's a bunch of bubbles, a bunch of foam on the top. And if I turn that down, a bunch of bubbles here, but not a bunch of foam, right? So that's pretty simple. Where the bubbles pop, foam is made. Finally, we have our appearance. This won't matter unless you're exporting from Liquigen. But if you just want to kind of get a better idea of what your render is going to look like, this is a good way to do it. So it's pretty straightforward. Again, the radius, how big the spray is, spray transparency, how clear it is, and default. Lower that, it's kind of nice. Kind of can see it a little easier. Next is your foam radius, how big the foam is. Kind of like it a little bit lower sometimes. Kind of looks more realistic. And then you have your transparency, like usual. And then you have your bubbles transparency / radius, how big your bubbles are. So all that is pretty self-explanatory. So now that you know how to control all of your foam and spray and all that goodness, let's look at getting it into Cinema 4D. All you're going to do is come over here to your simulation tab. Again, in my quick start, it's already there. If it's not there for you, just drag out from particles, select it, and then choose your directory where you want to save it, the name, pretty self-explanatory, the frame rate, and then all the things you actually want to export. What this is going to do is pack all these into one ABC file, which is awesome. Most people, I think, are exporting meshes, and then they're exporting just their whitewater. The only problem with that is it might not line up perfectly. It should probably be close enough, but it might not be a perfect one-to-one with your sim. So in order to do that, what you're going to do is export the main liquid as well. And this isn't going to export it as a mesh, it's going to export it as a whole bunch of particles. And you can see that if I go over, turn off liquid mesh and turn on points, all of these points are going to be exported into your Alembic file, which is sort of crazy. You're going to probably be dealing with a lot of points. However, and this doesn't look like it's going to look too good. All right, if I change this appearance, we can kind of see them easier. There we go. However, there's a few ways to work with this that I'm going to show you. Now that you have everything checked, all you have to do is choose the range, the stride. You probably want every frame. This is good if your step rate here is a different. If your step rate is different than if it's like 120, let's say, and you're going at 30 frames per second, that's where you might want to change your frame stride. And numbering offset's just what number it's going to start on. So that's pretty much it. All you have to do is hit export. There are upsides and downsides of exporting as particles. I'm going to get into the upsides in the next part. But the one downside is you're not going to get your velocity. So if you want to add motion blur to the water, that's probably not going to happen. But you can add motion blur to all of your particles. So that shouldn't be an issue. Okay, so we're about to jump into Cinema 4D. However, I want to point out something, and that's that you no longer have to use the old particle workflow that I had before with the Python script and all that jazz. So as of Cinema 4D 2024.5, and we're now on actually 2025. So if you're updated, or if you haven't updated yet, but we have 2024.5, this is going to work for you. If you have an older version than this, then you can watch my old tutorial. But I recommend updating because this new way of importing is so much better. There's no Python scripts. It just works, and it allows you to interact with your scene in many more ways than you could before. So here we are in C4D. Previously, when you wanted to import a particle system, it would bring it in as the old legacy thinking particles. And this was really limiting and really a pain to work with as far as like linking up your files and getting it all to work. Now, when you go to merge and you find your location and you want to bring in, we'll start with the Embergen embers just to kind of show the difference. And you hit open, you can choose as particle group. And what that's going to do is bring it in as a cache. So there you can see it has sort of the cache icon that you're used to. And if I hit play, it just works right away. And so let's focus on Liquigen though, which is our real pride and joy here. So if I go to my wave pool that I made earlier and I import it, we can make this 10 centimeters, why not? And here we have, well, I did them all as one, but there we go. So here we have our particles, and they're kind of hard to see because there's a lot of them. So first we have our pool, right? That's the main body. We have our spray, which is that little stuff coming off the top, our foam, and our bubbles. So let's just focus for now on the body. So you can see we have all of our particles, but this doesn't seem too useful, right? Because this won't render. If I turn on our thing here, we're not going to get anything at all. And if I were to make it render by adding a redshift tag to it, we're going to be using redshift for this. If I had a redshift tag to it and did like optimized spheres and I hit render, you can see we're just going to get a bunch of dots. And I don't really want a whole bunch of dots. Let's get a light in here. This isn't what we want, all right? Clearly there's a bunch of black dots. This isn't going to be good. So what we're going to do is create a volume out of all these particles. And this is where C4D kind of really shines here and shows, flexes its muscles. So we can get rid of that tag. And what we're going to do is create a volume builder. We're going to hold down Alt, and that just throws it in there instantly. And there we go. Now we have like this blurry, blocky thing. And then we're going to create a volume mesher. But that isn't what we want, right? We don't want this huge blocky thing. So what we're going to do is in our volume builder, we're going to choose a size of our particles and make that pretty small, like 2 or even 1 centimeter here. And then our voxel size the same. And now we're starting to get something a little more wave-like. And we can go down a little farther here, but if we ever go smaller than our voxel size, then that's going to cause problems. And then your voxel size will eventually start getting really slow, right? So the smaller you make this, the slower you get. But what you can do is kind of work in a larger size, and then right before rendering, really shrink it down. We can also do is look at your particle voxel range, and that can help with some of this stuff. So if you're not getting a look you want, if it's not really reading accurately, that's one of the ways you can do this. We're going to turn this on to 0.5 for now. And this, our particle size also to 0.5. And there you have it. Now you can hit use particle radius if you set the particle size, but I find it being uniform isn't really a problem. That's like, you might want to use that if you have different sizes of particles. But seeing as they're all the same size anyways, this doesn't really matter. What else do we want to do? We're going to add in a smooth, and we can change this to whatever we want. We can just do to, I don't even know how to pronounce this, but I think it's Liquigen For here. If, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. We're starting to get something that looks pretty nice and wave-like. And if these particles start bothering you when you zoom out, you can just turn off the visibility. All right, so here you can see we already have a very nice simulation with just a few items and a couple clicks. One of the tips too is your volume mesher here, the voxel range threshold. This is sort of going to be how many voxels it needs in order for it to make a mesh, right? So it's looking and saying how many of these voxels do I need to make a mesh, and so you can turn this down and erode it a lot, or you can turn this up and sort of thicken it. 50% is actually pretty decent, I find. But if you're getting like a lot of these little edges and weird stuff, you can turn it up a little higher as needed. Adaptive is going to be essentially the the mesh itself. So if I change this to lines, you can see here we sort of have lines all over the place. And they're equal, right? It's in a grid. It's sort of an equal grid no matter what. And what you can do is turn that up, and it's going to make it more sparse in areas that don't need it so much and more dense in areas that do. And this might be good if you're considering adding like a subsurface or something, or subdivide. That might be useful if you're considering adding like a subdivide. And that way you're not subdividing the whole thing evenly. You're subdividing the parts that need it more and the parts that need it less, not as much. And let's change back to this. So you can kind of see how that would work. But I'm not going to add a subdivide. So adaptive can be good. I typically have it off because it removes a lot of the micro details that I really like to have. So for your builder, you're going to want to experiment with a few things. You can erode and dilate as well, which is if you want it thicker, you can make it thicker. You know, if it's looking a little thin and you want to thicken that up, that's how you're going to do that. And that might feel a little more liquid in these scenarios. So there's a ton of things you can do here. There's a lot of tutorials on this, but for the basics, we've gotten started pretty quick here already, and we're already looking really, really good with just a little bit of work here. So now that we have this nice edge, let's get our particles involved, right? Let's get our spray, foam, and bubbles. Bubbles are pretty straightforward. You just kind of turn them on. You can add in a redshift tag, choose optimize spheres. That's sort of the fastest for rendering, and simply throw on a bubbly looking texture. You know, you make whatever color you want, and that's pretty much it for the bubbles, right? Like they're just going to be there under the surface, moving around. So you don't have to worry about them. Let's move on next to our foam, and there's two workflows for this. Okay, there's a easy and hard. So the easy workflow is just to drag over the same thing, optimize spheres, create a new material, create a new node material here, drop that on them, and go to your emission, and then turn that up, and then go to your geometry, and then change the opacity. And this is sort of how you do additive particles in C4D slash Redshift. So, I have that on spray. Let's throw that on our foam. And so now you see we get this really nice foam. And if I turn on our mesh here, you can already see it. Let's find a liquid here for this. Just to have it. Good liquid material. LFO's material from Pixel Lab all of theirs are awesome. I highly recommend them. You get really nice water shaders, and the deal is just crazy on that. So I highly recommend those. Let's add in the cube just so we have something to be underneath this, so it's just not going forever. And I'm going to change the color of the cube to custom, and then make that black just so we get a surface, right? So there you go. Now it's not just shooting through the rays through it forever. And there you go. We already have kind of great looking foam here. And I just applied this exact same thing, by the way, to your spray. And so what's nice about this is it works with motion blur. So if I go over here and I can just come up here to motion blur, turn it on if it's not on already. 360 is fine. And then if I do a quick render, you'll notice that the motion blur is in fact there. And you can dial this in and control it. And that sort of gives you that foamy look, right? And then from there, in your actual scene, how you get that kind of looking the way you want is simply by changing your foam and spray. Come over and change the opacity here. If you want to make it less visible, you can make it super opaque, right? And it's going to show up really heavily, but then, you know, your emission might be high. So that's just a one way to do it. It also creates these nice little reflections and whatnot. It lights your water up. So that's sort of the quick and dirty way of doing it. If you want to make the foam more apparent, all you have to do is increase the size of your object over here, right? So you can kind of get this nice fuzzy foam this way. And it's a bit of a hack, right? It's a bit of a cheat. but it's a good workflow to have in the back pocket whenever you need it. And as you can see, it doesn't look half bad. However, I found a better way to do this, but it's a lot more involved. The next way to do foam is similar to our mesher down here. So what we're going to do is the same thing, and we're going to turn all these off for speed's sake, just so we have this running as fast as possible. So you're going to go and grab your volume builder and stop there. We're not going to do a volume mesher, just a volume builder. As you can see, we sort of get this super blurry thing, but that's because we're still on a assigned distance field. And instead, we're going to switch this to fog. And now we're getting these little fog cards, right? These little stripes. And what we're going to do is turn down that voxel size until we get something kind of decent. And then same thing as before, we can change the size of our particles as well. Did also 1. So now it's a 1 and a 1. So we're going to do a few things here. One is we can add a smooth like before, and that's already starting to look a lot more like what we want. And let's start rendering this to see as we get closer. So in order to render this, I'm going to make yet another material. We're just going to stick with our node materials for now. I'm going to drag that onto there, and this isn't going to be good enough. So we're going to need to open up our editor. And in our node editor here, we're going to delete the standard node, and instead we're going to grab a volume. And we put that into the volume. And then over here in our channel, we're going to need to choose volume builder, volume builder. And that's going to let us choose the information from this. And now if you hit render, you can kind of see it. And this is going to control pretty much everything here. So if I dock this underneath, the things you might consider doing is, again, adding in some emission. So you can do color, and then you can just kind of crank that up. And while technically these wouldn't actually emit, it's sort of nice to just fake a really, really high scatter, because otherwise you have to crank the scatter up, like 20, and it starts changing the way it looks. So if you like the way it looks, but you just want it a little brighter, I might recommend just changing up the emission. Let's turn back on our water to kind of see that underneath it. And there you go. Now that's looking a lot more like sort of this like hazy fog and not really like foam. So in order to get it to look like foam, there's a few things we can do. One thing you can do is just add in a multiply. And what that's going to allow you to do is just crank up the density of that foam. The other thing you can do is keep going down in the size, but again, remember, the smaller this gets, the longer it's going to take to calculate. You also have the usual tools at your disposal, like the range and the curve. So if you really want to dial this in, you can kind of look at your fog range and then change your max output higher, and that's going to make it thinner, or change it lower, and that's going to make it a little thicker. Again, you can kind of change the order of things to figure out what works best. If you don't want to do Gaussian, you can again play with the other modes, median, mean, see what works best for you. Gaussian seems to be working okay for this. And you can tweak it until you kind of get exactly what you want. So if you want this to look even more dense, if you're not liking how fluffy it is still, one of the things you might want to come in and look at is your transparency. And so there you can see it now looks like a bunch of clouds. And you can control kind of the depth of that as well. So that's going to be for thickening it up a lot more and just making it real dense. So those are going to be your parameters, right? Your density up here, your transparency and the depth, And then your scatter is how much light it lets in. And then you also, again, have your emission if you want to play with that to avoid any shadows underneath or anything. But depending on the look you're going for, it's going to depend on sort of those three parameters. While this isn't going to let you work with the motion blur, it is pretty fast still. As you can see, I can click around and it will update. And it looks fantastic. So as you can see, it's pretty fast. It works really well, but there's also another couple reasons to do this. Another reason for doing it this way is because we're using a volume builder, anything that goes in this builder can be added to our current volume, our current mesh, right? So if I wanted to, and I go, oh shoot, we need this to actually be twice as big. What I can simply do is grab all of our particles, hold down Control, drag them to the side here, and double up the size of this thing. And I'm going to grab our floor here and extend that out as well. And now we have it twice as long without having to resim, without having to do anything extra. So as you can see, we've doubled our liquid by just dragging it out, and they can be combined however we want. But you can drop in multiple objects to this, extend it out if you wanted to, right? If we also wanted to, what we could do is turn that off, get rid of our duplicates here. We could also just extend this using a shape. So you remember that edge we had? Where it stays underneath a certain height. This is going to help us out with that. We want to drop, right? You're going to have to customize this. We want to drop that below the smoothing and the eroding and all that. And we can extend our water, right? So we can duplicate our water. We can extend it. I could run a second sim that's just for the rest of the ocean, right? That's not this crest, and bring that in and combine them. And so that's really this crazy power of doing it in this way. It's a really neat workflow. I think it's really awesome. It's super fun. There's ways, obviously, right, of smoothing this out. We could go in and work on that more. You know, we could do a second smooth. It's a Gaussian, which would help out, right? We could do a bunch of other stuff. So, there we go. So, you know, like, this is super cool. Now we have this infinite water. So, you know, if I had a shot, for instance, that was like this, and we knew we wanted to be farther back or something, and we just needed to extend it, well, now we can. Where we have this water that we added in after the fact, and then the original water up here. And we got that nice foam and everything working the way we want. So there you have it. That's how to make a non-destructive, particle-based liquid simulation and render it in Cinema 4D. If this video helped you out, hit subscribe, hit like, as well as check out some of our other videos on the channel. We have other tutorials, true, but there's a lot there for non-tutorial people. There's some theory. I'm documenting the entire process of the short film we've been working on. There's discussions between me and my partner, Rob, about, you know, film and theory, as well as thoughts on AI and why I don't really think you need to worry about it as much as many people are saying we do. So with all that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.